Hello everybody, welcome back to Business and Technology in Tennessee, a podcast from InfoSystems. I'm Josh Davis, Marketing Director at InfoSystems, and today I have a special guest with me, Bruce Tate, who works for a company called I Can Make It Better.
That's right.
And who also is working here in Chattanooga to bring a programming conference to town. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. But first, to get started, Bruce, let's just talk a little bit about who you are and what your role is. Can you introduce I Can Make It Better and what your role is at the company?
Of course, I like to say that I am a programmer and manager, and I write books and software. So I Can Make It Better is a company that I'm very fond of. We build marketing, research, insight communities, and that means that we help people ask advanced questions to their customers. And you might have seen survey providers, and surveys are getting longer and longer. Well, if you go back to the same people that you trust, your most passionate set of customers, that's not as big of a problem. You can go back, and the surveys can get shorter, so the insights can be more powerful, and we provide a set of tools to stitch those conversations together.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a no-brainer that the longer and more complex a survey is, the less likely you're going to get the responses that you want. So keeping them short, keeping questions simple, keeping responses easy to understand, things like that are definitely important.
And not paying for your answers. That's a big deal. So we help you find your most passionate customers. We build an incentive program to populate those communities.
That's cool.
And then we allow engaging types of conversations with different question types in the surveys, different feedback types than just surveys, and things like that.
Cool. So, and people can find out information at icanmakeitbetter.com.
That's correct.
About the company. But what we're here to talk about today is more your background in programming and some of the things you're doing in the community here in Chattanooga. So I noticed, we met for lunch, it's been a couple of weeks ago, to kind of talk about doing this podcast, and you talked about your history with programming languages and learning different languages, and the fact that you've written books about learning different programming languages. Did you set out to be an author? What's the deal here with all this, the languages and the books and everything else?
So all of my best-selling books are embarrassing stories, every single one of them. Only the best ones. So probably the most famous for a while was called Bitter Java, and that was written out of fear. Basically, I had left IBM to join a startup, and my timing was impeccable. 2 months later, that startup was circling the toilet. I was laid off, and the economy was soft. I couldn't get a job anywhere. And so I'd written a informational manual that we sold internally at IBM as a book, and I thought that I was a big deal author. But my backup plan, if I couldn't get a job, was to write. And it came time to write, and I didn't know what to write about. So I wrote this book called Bitter Java, which is a great title and a horrible way to learning from bad code, right?
Yeah.
Don't do that. This is bad code, don't do that. Also don't do that, also don't do that, right? So it's not a practical way to learn.
Right.
But it was an engaging title at a time when people were frustrated with the alternative programming languages disappearing. So people imagined what the book was about. This was before you could buy the ebook, before the book was available. It really popped and disappeared just as quickly, but it did well enough over a short enough span where I was invited to speak on some circuits and launch my consulting career. And so, go ahead.
Java, is that where you started in programming? What's your background with languages? Because I know you don't know just one. You're a pretty accomplished programmer.
So actually, I learned at a very young age. My father got a Radio Shack color computer for me for Christmas, and it completely changed my path. I latched onto it. I wrote these games, and so I really loved BASIC. In college, I learned the Pascal language, like a lot of us did. It was a great way to kind of drop the crutches in the language, like go-tos and things. So go-tos are basically, you could relabel that programming command bad habit. And so Pascal stripped away some bad habits and kind of purified me a little bit. Java was the first practical language I learned, and though bitter Java wasn't good, after speaking on the conference circuit called No Fluff, Just Stuff, I met some very strong programmers and mentors, and eventually wrote some books that were a little bit more exploratory, if you will. So there was a book called Beyond Java, and the idea there was, again, I was afraid. I thought that things were happening and stirring in the greater community beyond the Java space, though Java developers and Java, ecosystems were treating the language more like a church than a language at the time. And I wanted to pick my eyes up a little bit and see what else was out there, and that basically started to snowball down a mountain, and then I became more and more of a language geek through the years. In 2010, I wrote a book called 7 Languages in 7 Weeks. And that was another expression of fear, where I didn't know where object-oriented programming was going, and I thought some things might be starting to happen around the perimeter. And I decided, in maybe a smart moment, maybe a little bit less so, but I decided to invite people along as I took that research journey. And the book did well, and I got a lot of insights out of that process.
Cool. And so a couple of things I picked up on out of that. You're talking about Radio Shack computers.
Right.
You're not the first person that I've heard who got into IT and programming or whatever line of IT they're in, because as a kid they were going to Radio Shack and asking to use the demo computer, or got their parents to buy one of the Radio Shack computers, and you've dated yourself a little bit by bringing that up.
As if anybody else would.
Yeah, but I wonder if there's a difference between, and I know we're going to get into more of this as we talk about your books and the conference, programming conference that you're working on bringing to town, but is there a do you see a huge difference in the way that today's young programmers are getting into programming and getting interested in that versus your generation and how you got into it? And there are a lot of guys your age who are, core programmers at major companies and major technology providers. And so what's this younger generation doing to get interested?
It's interesting. When I learned, we had our limitations. The limitations were the things that drove us the fastest. For example, my computer was much larger than that laptop, than the Surface. It had 4K kilobytes of memory.
Yeah.
So you could fit about that many word processor documents in it if you completely discarded the programs that it took to run them.
Yeah.
So I can remember a time when my best friend's dad was starting to be an electrical engineer before that had computer ramifications. So I remember buying 2 cheap 16K chips, breaking off the pin of one of them and piggybacking one chip on top of the other to expand my memory from 4K to 32K.
Wow.
And it was a really an altering experience for me.
Yeah.
And taught me not to accept my limitations. And
Yeah.
I think that for a long time, when the IBM personal computer came out, and beyond that to clones and Apples, we put out a generation of computer users, but not necessarily computer programmers, because we didn't have the place where people could explore ideas and come up against limitations. And we're starting to get that back. There's a great movie called Slingshot, maybe, I'll look this up and
Okay.
you can put it on your notes.
Yeah.
I think it's Slingshot. It's by the creator of the Segway,
Huh.
and about his problem solving and starting to find ways to get kids engaged in technology. And he actually brought people into technology and programming with robotics.
Yeah.
And so that's a great cycle, right? So you put your robot in the ring, and you make it do your commands, and then you give it some tasks, and you get that feedback cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And you also get to look at the whole product cycle around the technology. So robotics is not just about robotics; it's about project management, it's about programming, it's about engineering, it's about communications, it's about reaching out to the community to get support. Mm-hmm. And that's a lot like raising money for a startup. So some things like that are starting to happen, or even playing games. If you're into Minecraft, you can code Minecraft extensions in Java. There are languages like Lego, and I don't know what some of the other experimental ones are. There's one called Elm, though, that allows you to learn functional programming by writing games. If I change these parameters, Mario jumps differently, and everything is live. So it's starting to happen. We're discovering that to teach programming, we don't have to provide solutions. We have to provide sandboxes.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. It's like the younger generation now has all these direct applications right in front of them every day that showcase the need for technology and people who can program and work on systems. It hadn't always been like that, but that kind of drives into the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is there's a lot of programming language out there. I mean, you just talked about languages that are even specific to like product sets like Lego and things. So when you think about the world of programming languages, the entire ecosystem, especially the ones that are applicable to business software applications and hardware and things like that, why are there so many languages? Why are they continuing to proliferate? What's the driver behind that?
That's a great question. And you can answer it in two ways. Let me answer the question exactly like you answered it, and then let's change it up a little bit. So the question that you asked is essentially what drives language creation? Yeah. And the corollary to that question is what drives language adoption? So I think that language creation sometimes comes out of the need to invent, but more often than that, it comes out of a business need. And language adoption definitely comes out of a business need. So you can go way back to the time when we were programming basic hardware with ones and zeros and switches, and eventually there wasn't enough continuity between what you were thinking and what you were typing, and so we needed to move the language to something that worked much more like the human mind did. So we went to higher level languages. That was a business need. More recently, Java was adopted not because it was a cool object-oriented language, not because it had a lot of internet features. Well, I guess it did indirectly. What happened with Java was we could not deploy applications when we had a proprietary client talking to a proprietary server using a proprietary networking protocol. And things got worse and worse as you added layers. As you added the database manager, the communications manager, it got unmanageable. Yeah. So when it was time to deploy those systems, what you did was you strapped on your roller skates, you took your diskettes, and you started stuffing them into computers. And that killed companies. And eventually, directors, CTOs said, I can't bear this deployment problem, and so I need to find a solution. And the solution that basically came out was to use this academic platform, the World Wide Web, to basically push applications to the users indirectly. And Java basically enabled that ecosystem to grow beyond just the very simple tools of the time, the CGI scripts and batch programs and things like that.
Now, I know most recently you've been working closely with the developer of a language called Elixir.
Yes.
And writing books,
yes,
articles. I mean, it seems like you're pretty deep in that. Can you talk a little bit about your relationship to Elixir and the Elixir language's creator?
Yeah, so basically I went from Java to Ruby, and the reason that I did that is that I like to work with very small teams, and the Java language it really makes it easy to work with large teams. It makes it easy to get things adopted. It does make things difficult. It's not super expressive. So when I want to build something quickly and get that to market and basically iterate on my software as a very small company or as a startup, Ruby made a lot more sense to me than Java. Now, eventually, as we started to talk to potential acquirers and as we started to gain some success and get customers, we recognized the value of things like better concurrency, better ability to react to a crash or availability, and better performance, better ability, a higher ability to organize concepts in our head so that fewer programmers could do more work.
Yeah.
And I started looking, so that's actually what happened to prompt me to write 7 languages in 7 weeks. And I didn't really find anything in that list of languages. What I did find was that we were about to see a new programming paradigm. So some of the leaders in the Java space, some of the leaders in the Ruby space, and the .NET space were starting to go other places to find, to organize the concepts in their head. And the problem that I was really worried about was probably all the computers back here are multi-core computers. And the reason is that physics has caught up with this. Chip designs are changing, so instead of cramming more and more into the same chip, the circuits are too small to be able to do that anymore. We stack them up. So in order to program a system like that, the languages have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. They have to be able to support concurrency.
Gotcha.
So I went to London to actually go to a talk from a kid, I guess 24 at the time. Yeah, that's a kid in terms of a language creator.
Yeah.
Brilliant guy who'd been working on Ruby on Rails, who understood language adoption and the building of a community. And he was starting to get how to build a reliable system. And he started to explore paradigms beyond just the object-oriented paradigm that's where Ruby, Python, Java, .NET, all those languages came from. And so I basically found a manuscript about this language from a guy named Dave Thomas, and he was the guy who discovered Ruby in the United States, and he was also the guy that formed a publishing company that's just enormously successful in an industry of dying computer publishing companies. So I took Dave's manuscript and I went to his talk, and I was trembling, and I said, Jose, could you sign this book? And I just made a complete idiot of myself. And he turned around and walked out of the room. And I said, oh man, I have just completely embarrassed myself. And he came back with 7 languages in 7 weeks. And he said, Bruce, I know who you are. This has been some of the inspiration for the Elixir language.
Cool.
And so since then, we've worked very closely together. I'm probably more of a marketing guy for the Elixir language, which is an interesting change-up for me.
Yeah.
I'm normally the technology leader in all the things I'm involved with, but with Jose, he was so good at taking advice. He was so good at putting some of that advice into practice that we formed a tight relationship, and the rest is history.
Yeah.
I wanted to tell one more story though. We talked about the programming language on Legos, and that's interesting to me because I think that one of the things that makes Legos interesting is that when you have bigger, richer blocks, you can build faster.
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't know that when Elixir was created. In fact, Jose was trying to do all the work himself. He was trying to build the programming language, he was trying to build all the database connections to it, and he was also trying to build a web server all at the same time. And I said, Jose, I really want to use this stuff, but you're an idiot if you think that you can do all this stuff at the same time. He didn't appreciate that at first, but we basically came to a place where he asked the question, so where do I find the programmers? And I said, it might not be in a circle that you already have. What we need to do is build a Lego kit, which is one fraction of the effort for building web servers. So we built this Lego kit and we called it Plug.
Mm-hmm.
And 2 months later, there was a guy named Chris McCord, who's going to be at our conference, that created one of the fastest web servers in the world. We didn't know who he was. We didn't know he even existed. But we kind of cast our line out there with a nice bait, which was a Lego kit for building web servers. And 3 or 4 people came back, and we picked the person that we could work with, and the rest is history.
Yeah, that's a great story. And now you alluded to a conference that you're bringing here to Chattanooga. Let's talk a little bit about that. So the Gig City Elixir Conference. Elixir is in the title, so I assume there's going to be a heavy presence of Elixir-involved people, that programming language there. But I think it's, from what you've said, it's a little more than just an Elixir conference. It goes beyond that. So why should people in Chattanooga care about Gig City Elixir Conference, and what are they going to get out of being there?
Yes, so Chattanooga is very much a traditional town from a technology perspective. That's changing with the Gig and with the EDNI, and there's a presence that's growing beyond. But basically, in terms of a conference, we'll talk about my motivations for creating it a little bit later. But in terms of reach, I have a pretty good name in the Elixir space as one of the early adopters and one of the co-authors. So I've written books with Jose and with Chris.
Okay.
I'd be remiss if I didn't use those tools to help adopt the language.
Yeah.
But I do believe that in Chattanooga, and really in the Southeast in general, we have to cater to a much broader set of programmers. We need to be able to reach Java developers, .NET developers, and also we need to be able to reach people that are interested in what's happening in the technology space. And so in order to do that, we've invited people from many different technological backgrounds. There's a guy named John Hughes, and he's one of the foremost computer scientists in the world, and he's coming from Gothenburg. And he's created, not only was he on the panel that created the most important academic language, which is called Haskell, he's also the creator of a testing philosophy called property-based testing, where when I write software to write a test, I might say there's a thing called plus and I want to test it. So I'm going to say, I'm going to give plus a 1 and a 2, and it'll calculate 1 plus 2, and I'll say, I want you to yell at me. I want you to send a virtual alert if 1 plus 2 is not equal to 3. So the way that software testing happens now, you have to pick all those numbers and all the solutions and compare them.
Yeah.
What John says is that let's let the computer do the work. Let's let the computer come up with any possible combination of numbers and throw those combinations at the computer. We shouldn't describe the test inputs. We should describe the plus thing. And if you talk about the properties of the plus thing and let the computer do the work, you get much more powerful, much more complete tests for much less effort. And he'll be at the conference.
That's interesting. The concept of letting the computers do more of the work, because InfoSystems is an infrastructure company. We do lots of storage networks and networking and compute systems and make it all work together as a cohesive IT system. But one of the things that's beginning to break through, I mean, you're seeing it in major enterprise organizations now, and it's the trickle down happens, where after a major enterprise adopts some technology, then they figure out ways to make it accessible to the mid-market and then eventually to mom and pop businesses out there. But if you think about that concept, artificial intelligence, machine learning, analytics, those types of things are starting the descent down into mid-market and small business applications. And it's the same concept. We've got all these advanced computer systems now. Let's let them do the work.
Right.
And humans can interpret the output and utilize all of the things that are happening to our benefit, and then continue to tweak and build. But not everything is reliant on the human brain now to be the main driver. The computers are sort of becoming self-sufficient in some ways. It's amazing.
Absolutely. And you mentioned machine learning. Now, machine learning is still very much based on the Python community and the offshoots of the Python community, but you also mentioned things like availability. In availability research, some of the best stuff that's happened has happened with a tiny language called Erlang. And you might not have heard of it, but if you send text messages, odds are probably like 1 message in 3 goes over Erlang, which is the foundation for Elixir. And Chattanooga may not have a lot of functional developers, but we have a lot of corporations that are forward thinking. And sending those folks to another object-oriented language with regional talent is interesting, but it's not enough. You also have to be watching the research that's happening in the functional space. And that's very difficult to do in a functional conference unless you have a tremendous amount of talent at the conference that can take complex concepts and distill them. Well, we've got Dave Thomas, who is good at doing it. He's built a publishing company to do exactly that. We have John Hughes, who teaches freshmen in college with no programming background at all how to do functional programming in the most complicated language in the world. We have Stu Holloway. We have, so in a region that is famous for good regional speakers, or in a city that's good for punching over its weight and attracting good regional speakers. We just had a fabulous conference called Scenic City Summit. But the language, the conference that I'm talking about is bringing 6 speakers that have given international keynotes in the last 5 years, at least 2 of them each. So we have a tremendous number of teachers coming, and the instructions that we gave them are to teach about basics, foundations, and programming. So while we may be using Elixir in some of the talks, not all of them, we'll also be talking about things like, what's the best way to document your code? And hint, it's not a comment.
Yeah.
The talk is called Lies, Damn Lies, and Comments. But there are ways to basically communicate with the structure of your programs and with the names of your variables and functions, and with basically using some programming constructs that don't rely on comments at all. So then when you change that critical line of code that says we've gone from dollars to cents in our representation, and you forget to change the comment, you're not out several $100,000.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned the international speaker lineup that you've got coming to the Gig City Elixir Conference. Now, when we had lunch, you were talking about, and I assume your speaker lineup reflects this, you were talking about, and what you just mentioned with the sort of the regional bubble that we have here, there's some predominant technologies that are most commonly used in this region, and the people who typically speak at the events and share, the thought leaders in this region, all kind of sort of revolve around those most common technologies. This conference is going sort of outside of those boundaries.
Yes.
And you mentioned before one of the main purpose of the conference is to get people to pick their eyes up and look toward the future of programming, not necessarily what's right in front of you today. And I also understand that with the speakers who are coming, you sort of cashed in on some favors, and there's some interesting stories there. So how did you get engaged with these speakers and get them coming to Chattanooga to share?
I cashed in every favor that I've made over the last 20 years to build this lineup, and I hope it's worth it. I really think it will be. The most interesting story. There's a man named John Hughes, and I met him in a particularly embarrassing circumstance. He's one of my idols, but I never actually met him face to face till I went to Stockholm to give a conference. And he's from Gothenburg, which is across Sweden, but he was also at the same conference. And Swedish audiences are traditionally very, very quiet and reserved. And I'm an energy speaker.
Yeah.
And when I feel the feedback, when I get a connection with the audience, I am unstoppable, and I am incredibly awkward when I don't.
Yeah.
So I've had talks in Japan where things fell apart, and talks in Sweden where things fell apart. But this particular talk, this audience was eating out of my hand. I would tell a joke, and you would see ha 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 ha. Everybody would laugh, and I would have drama, and people would lean forward, and it was just an out-of-body experience. I'd never seen it before. So I said, about a third of the way through, I said, I'm going to finish my planned material early, and I'm going to just take questions so I can engage more closely with people and just riff on some topics, on the things that they want to hear about.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was about 2 questions into that period, really the meat of my talk. And this man asked probably the most perceptive question that I've ever heard. I don't remember the question for the reason which will become clear in a second. So I said, oh man, I have this audience. This question, this response are going to drive everything home. So I say, that's a very perceptive question. What is your name? And he said, John Hughes. So when he said that, my programming idol all my adult life, my friends were in the back of the room on the Twitter saying, Bruce Tate, starstruck, and I could see the buzz and the laughter, and I didn't get another word out.
Oh, man.
So later we were at a party, and I happened to be sitting next to John, and just kind of we were laughing and reminiscing about this. And he talked to the host of the party, and the host asked him, what's your favorite bottle of scotch? And he kind of chuckles, and then he gave some obscenely old, obscenely expensive vintage. And Francesco, the host of the party, leans forward and says, John, reach into the couch. And he reaches into the couch, and he pulls out this obscenely old, obscenely expensive bottle of scotch. And I got to share that with John.
Cool.
So a little bit later, just down the street with me, there's a man named Steve Garrison. He's a great man, and his son had an experience where he wanted to distill bourbon, but in Texas. And Steve, being the great father that he is, wanted to talk his son out of this enterprise at all costs. And so his son basically said, no, Dad, I'm going to do this. And followed the directions from a setup, a close friend from Bourbon County, everything except he used local ingredients, and he used the same kinds of barrels, the same kinds of woods. He actually used anything that he wasn't contractually obligated to do locally. He went out to Bourbon County to do, and the whole setup promptly blew up because the temperature swings made the cask explode.
Oh, man.
And they redid the same setup but with thicker casks. And when they sent out the bourbon to be measured, they said, this can't be right. And he said, oh no, I've messed up again. He said, no, you misunderstand. Your sugar content is too high for a first run bourbon. He had the whiskey of the year.
Wow.
It's Garrison Brothers. So and Steve, when he was telling me this story, after I told him about the story with John, he hands me a bottle of Garrison Brothers, an award-winning bourbon. It said, you have to get this to John Hughes. And so I used that as the bait to draw him to the conference.
So he's coming.
After he signed up, everybody else signed up.
He's coming to share his expertise and all of that stuff. But there's a bottle of bourbon involved too.
There is.
That's great.
And I think that Steve has since said, okay, if he's really coming and I'm going to present it, I'll make sure he gets some of the best stuff. So
yeah, that's awesome.
That would be exciting.
Hey, we do have a local distiller here in town now too. He might be a great little visit if he's a bourbon aficionado.
Right. So actually, we are doing a conference closing party in honor of the folks we're inviting to via scholarship and mentoring at the Chattanooga whiskey facility.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah. It's kind of a can't make it a theme of the conference, but it's the theme of the conference.
Okay, so before we move on to kind of a closing segment, there's one more area that I really want to bring up in our podcast discussion, but I also want to make sure everybody hears when and where they're going to be able to attend the Gig City Elixir Conference. Can you share some details about it?
Yes, Gig City Elixir is going to be at the Aquarium Complex. It's 2 Aquarium Way. That's the space right above Puckett's. We are going to be October 26th and 27th, and you can get tickets at gigcityelixir.com.
Okay.
And that's ELIXIR. I've misspelled that more times than I can count.
And I'll definitely have links in the article that I post on our website with this podcast episode. But October 26th and 27th.
Yes.
At the aquarium.
Yes.
At the aquarium complex.
Right.
Not in the water tank or anything like that. Yeah. But and gigcityelixir.com.
Yes. And I wonder if we could talk briefly about the diversity initiatives at the conference.
Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to get into next before we sign off. Is I know, when we had lunch, you made it a point to share that one of your passions, and that, there are people always have sort of social or other types of passions related to their career or the work they're in. Happens all the time. And, I've had Brian, the executive director of CoLab, as a guest on the podcast before, and that's actually who shared your contact information with me about the Gig City Elixir Conference. My friends over at CoLab contacted and said, hey, this sounds really interesting. You may want to reach out to these folks and see if there's synergy there, and if that's something you want to cover on the podcast. It's a fantastic topic for the podcast, because this is exactly what we want to talk about, is what's happening in technology, not only in Chattanooga, but in our region, in Tennessee, in the areas around. But, when he was on the program, we discussed this topic that's also dear to you, which is equity in programming and diversity in programming. I mean, when we talked about it, it was more just technology in general, because this is not an issue that's just limited to programming. It's across the board. I mean, if you look at IT companies and IT departments within companies, things look pretty homogenous.
They do.
And so, there are a lot of things going on out in the community through nonprofit organizations, through conferences and other initiatives to change that, to broaden the scope of technology and pull in people who may not either have access to having that option, or people who may not have an interest because of their environment or things like that. But how are you going to address equity in programming at the Gig City Elixir Conference, and why does that mean so much to you?
So first, the reason that it means so much is twofold. Let's be practical and then go beyond that. So practically, diversity makes sense. We know as humans that human populations do better with the diversity of genes. Mm-hmm. That diversity allows different problems to be solved in different ways. And within a population, it's an extremely important thing to happen. The same is true of programming. So women and programmers tend to be better at collecting requirements. African Americans in programming tend to attack problems in different ways, just as you would see cultural influences in, for example, the game of chess. Mm-hmm. So diversity basically makes teams stronger. If we embrace diversity, we'll get stronger as an industry. So the second thing is that it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say the name of a conference, but the second that I decided that this was an important topic to solve, I was in a conference. There were 403 people in the room. I counted them. And there were 4 African Americans or women, or actually minorities of any kind, or women in the conference at all. And that was just gut-wrenching. It's not right. So I do believe that there are 3 things that are really important to me here. First, the timing. As programming paradigms change, there's an opportunity to disrupt things a little bit and maybe invite people into the process that haven't been there before. The second thing is that this language switch, that's kind of happening slowly. We're on the front end of a wave that's coming, and we can watch that happen with the leadership and some of the early adopters. But as that wave comes through, this is one of the first times in history that the new language, that in order to embrace the new language, you don't have to know all programming history. In fact, we'll be attacking the most basic problems in very different ways. So this idea will allow us to achieve parity much more quickly than we could at other times. And the third reason is, I think that there's also disruption coming in the way that we teach programming in general. You mentioned there being a lack of young people, and I mentioned the idea of a sandbox. But there's an education technique that allows you to apply tiny problems with greater and greater complexities, with a broader and broader set of tools, and more exploration to ramp people up pretty quickly. And we're using those techniques in the folks that we mentor for the conference. And the folks that we mentor will get scholarships for the full price of the conference. So our goal is to have at least 10%, hopefully 20% women and minorities. And that's not a great number.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong, that's a horrible number, but
that's still a great goal compared to where things are now.
Yes.
So, and you mentioned having scholarships available and mentoring.
Yes.
How would people who are interested in attending, who may need access to scholarships and may be a perfect candidate for that type of mentorship, how do they approach getting access?
Go to gigcityelixir.com. That's ELIXIR.com. We have a contact, which I think is organizers at gigcityelixir.com. I'm the one that's in charge of African American and minority men. Anna Sherman is handling the scholarship program for women. And let me point out that Bleacher Report is our community sponsor, and they're helping to actually fund these scholarships. It's been a tremendous partnership working with them.
Yeah, that's great. And the more inviting and inclusive all of these companies and conferences and technologies are, and it's just like you said, the more diversity you can attract into the ecosystem, the more it's going to benefit everyone involved. Because for the reason you mentioned, if you have very similar people all working on a project, they're going to probably have very similar thoughts toward the project and perform work a very similar way. And yeah, there are differences between everybody that aren't limited to skin color or ethnicity or gender or things like that. But those factors help formulate people's perception and reality. And so the odds that someone of a different race or ethnicity or gender is going to approach a problem differently than someone else is way greater than two people who are very similar to one another. So
Right. I mean, go back to baseball and Jackie Robinson.
Yeah.
Even look at the market imbalance. If you've got a huge untapped portion of the population and you can figure out how to tap it before your competitors do, you'll win.
Yeah.
You'll just win.
Well, I think that's a pretty good place to wrap up the episode. I don't want to go on too long, or we might have people who get bored and abandon. So I'm really excited about attending the Gig City Elixir Conference. You can count on me being there, and hopefully InfoSystems can be involved in some way beyond just having a podcast where we talked about it. And we're also involved in initiatives in the community to provide scholarships for different types of technologies and training programs and things like that for minorities, and it may be for economic reasons or other types of reasons that people don't have access to education and programming, and we like being involved in those types of initiatives, so that's great.
Would you like a discount code for your audience?
Sure. How about instead of just broadcasting it on the podcast, we'll just link to it on our website.
Wonderful.
We'll provide a link to the Gig City Elixir website with the code that people can enter if they're going to purchase a ticket, and
Sure.
And that way we'll be able to.
And we'll do the first 10 people with this discount code. We'll give the same pricing as early bird pricing.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. So you heard it directly from one of the organizers of the conference. If you want opportunity to get in with a little bit of a discount, here you go. Don't sit on your laurels. So.
Thanks for listening.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Bruce. This has been a great conversation. It was wonderful talking to you. I can't wait for the conference, and hope you enjoyed this experience as well.
Thank you so much.